200 feet beneath the Earth's crust, two men lay trapped on a slippery hunk of rock with water gushing between them. What began as just another cave expedition for Andrew Munoz and Jason Story had turned into an 18-hour-long fight for survival. Now, suffering from severe hypothermic temperatures, the men huddled together and silently questioned whether they'd ever see their families again. On the morning of December 5th, 2015, Jason Story prepared himself for the thrilling day ahead of him. He and 5 others planned to explore a remote cave only accessible to experienced spelunkers. Though Jason was a newcomer to the sport, having only gone caving 4 times, he was confident. After all, he'd be in the midst of cavers with years of experience. Jason braced himself for the wet weather with a t-shirt, 2 sweatshirts, overalls, water-resistant socks and jacket, and rubber boots. He also had with him his newly acquired helmet and headlamp. Eager to begin his adventure, he kissed his wife goodbye, and she told him, good-naturedly, to be careful. With that, Jason set out for Canada's Vancouver Islands, which lay 80 miles northwest of his home. His real destination, though, was a relatively little-known cave called Cascade. The rain poured down that morning as Jason was driving, but Jason hardly noticed. What could a little rain hurt? Once he arrived in Port Alberni, British Columbia, he stopped in the parking lot of a candy store. There he met up with Adam Shepard, a paramedic who had recently sustained a mild back injury, Zach Zoriski, a chef and volunteer firefighter, and Matt Watson and Arthur Taylor, both computer programmers. Leading the pack, though, was Jason's friend, 33-year-old Andrew Munoz, who actually introduced Jason to the sport. Andrew is a former caving guide and also a paramedic. Jason himself spent the majority of his time as the owner of a window washing company and, of course, raising his 2 toddlers. But the stop at the candy store wasn't just for fun. It was here that the men would obtain access to Cascade Cave. The cave's entrance lies on the ground and is blocked by a locked steel door to keep amateur cavers out. Like old folklore, the location of the entrance is passed from caver to caver with no signage to guide you. To obtain entry, spelunkers need to gain the trust of the key holder and sign a waiver. Also needed is a thin, 30-foot aluminum ladder that drops into the 3-story entrance of the cave. Cascade is just one of over 1,000 mysterious subterranean caves and tunnels that lie in Vancouver Island. These caves offer challenging mazes of cathedrals, mineral formations, and ancient native pictographs. They're made for the thrill seekers who enjoy the murky and unmapped bowels of the earth. But the Cascade cave system is not for curious minds and first-timers. Being a total of 338 feet deep and a mile long, the cave is full of tight squeezes and nearly impossible to pass corners. After obtaining the key, the aluminum ladder, and signing the waivers, the 6 men drove up the half-mile-long unmarked trail to a clearing. There, they checked all of their inventory: ropes, harnesses, gas-fueled jet boil stove, water, food, first aid kit, and a mylar blanket. The cavers piled everything on their backs and began hiking. Upon reaching the cave's entrance, which is easily overlooked, they used the key to open the gate and threw down the ladder. Each one made the 30-foot climb down. The last one to enter locked the door above them. The 6 made their way through the cave with relative ease, their headlamps clearly illuminating the way. As with most caves, it was much colder than above ground, but it was manageable. They knew the water level would be slightly raised due to the rain outside, but they weren't aware of one very important detail. Another thunderstorm was fast approaching. As they squeezed through narrow and jagged passageways, water rose to their ankles and then to their shins. Andrew, the group's lead, called out to ask if everyone was all right. One by one, the group responded that they were, and they all agreed to continue. About 45 minutes in, though, Adam called out. The constant hunching over was beginning to take its toll on his recently injured back. His buddy, Matt, escorted him to the entrance and then rejoined the 4 others waiting for him. For the next hour and a half, the explorers crawled and slid through the varying terrain of the cave, slowly and methodically. Jason was in awe of his surroundings. This newfound hobby enthralled him, and he loved that each adventure was different than the last. The group soon approached the Bastard's Crawl, a narrow passage that leads to a tight downhill slope. 4 different streams meet here on any given day, but due to the storm above them, the water was moving faster than normal. The spelunkers continued, though, crawling their way to the top of Double Trouble, a waterfall named for its stream being split by a jutting rock. They set up their ropes to make the 50-foot descent down the waterfall. As Jason descended, water gushed all around him just as it did the others. He could feel his heart beating as if it would burst from his chest. After successfully descending Double Trouble, the group of 5 stopped for lunch. They'd been in the cave for just about 3 hours. The handy jet boil was used to heat their food, and after 20 minutes they were ready to go again. The end of the cave was less than a quarter-mile away, and the group was determined to reach it. They crawled their way down, getting closer to the 300 feet below the ground mark. But it was about this time that Zach began shivering and was unable to stop. The temperature in caves can hit people unexpectedly, especially when accompanied by rainwater. With safety their top priority, the group decided to head back together. Matt went first, then Arthur, then Jason, Zach, and lastly Andrew. The rushing of the water grew with each step they took. As they retraced their steps, they noticed that their feet began sinking into the muddy floor, far deeper than they had on their entry. At around 2 p.m., the group was again approaching the base of Double Trouble, but something had changed. The split waterfall, which had flowed gently just hours before, was now a white froth of roaring water. But there was no choice now. They had to press on. Matt hooked the rope to the top of Double Trouble, attached his harness, and began making the upward climb. Though only 50 feet, ascending a subterranean waterfall is no easy job. With such slippery walls, they had to move slowly, hand by hand and foot by foot. After what seemed like hours of grueling climbing, Matt reached the top. He threw the rope down to the others. Arthur made the climb next, then Jason. Now at the top, Jason took the lead, and once again reached the narrow Bastard's Crawl. But the freezing water was much deeper than before, and it smashed into his face like an icy wall. After powering through this, he emerged through the opening and into the next passage. However, he was puzzled to see that it split off into 2 sections. He decided to retreat and asked the other 2 behind him for directions. As he crawled back through the narrow corridor, a sudden gush of water swept him onto his back, completely submerging him. A sting of panic ran through Jason. If he didn't get on his feet, the stream would carry him over Double Trouble's 50-foot cliff and he'd plummet onto the rocks below. However, he quickly realized that he was unable to move. He struggled for a moment and began to feel a pressure on his foot. It didn't take long to realize that it was caught, sandwiched between 2 shelves of rock. The sting of panic was beginning to take over. He began frantically screaming for help, but as the water rushed over him, he was unable to grab any attention. It hadn't even been 5 minutes, but to Jason, it seemed like an eternity. He felt his life flash before his eyes as he remembered his family waiting for him to return home in one piece. Zach was following Jason when he noticed Jason was in trouble. He relayed this information to Andrew down below. Andrew scrambled to the top and immediately attempted to guide Jason out of the rushing waters. Only able to catch a breath every so often, Jason was fighting to get out. Only his gloved hands could be seen emerging from the water. Finally, with Andrew's encouragement, Jason was able to pull himself up, but his boot was still lodged in between the 2 rock shelves. At least his head was through, though, and he could breathe, but his words almost sounded slurred and nearly unrecognizable. At long last, 20 minutes after becoming stuck, Jason emerged entirely from the Bastard's Crawl, gasping for air. Andrew settled him on a very narrow ledge just inches above the water. Jason appeared shaken, his face an expression of both horror and relief. Andrew asked Zach to stay with Jason while he retrieved their supply bags. Once he was back, about 15 minutes later, Zach warned him of the water continuing to rise and told him that he was going to join Matt and Arthur further ahead. Andrew knew that before they could continue, he needed to stay with Jason to bring his body temperature back to normal. He told Zach this and asked that if they didn't catch up in 30 minutes to notify search and rescue. By now, Jason's body was turning blue from hypothermia, so much so that he stopped shivering. His body was past the point of attempting to keep itself warm. Andrew said he believed Jason was in stage 2 of hypothermia. He knew he needed to act quickly. Andrew wrapped his friend in a Mylar emergency blanket he'd brought with him and fired up his jet boil. He warmed hot water and used it to pour down Jason's clothes until his skin once again flushed with normal color. But nature wouldn't wait for long. As the downpour continued to fill the cave, Andrew asked Jason if he was ready to hike back to the entrance. They both got up and began to climb, fighting the stream for every inch. As they reached the top of the crawl, they realized with alarm that they couldn't continue. As the water rose, their only breathing room would have been the 4 inches of air between the water and the roof of the cave. They needed to turn back. The 2 men spotted a ledge to sit on and wait out the water. They weren't expecting to stay here long, as the ledge was more so an awkward 45-degree angle with just barely enough room for the 2 of them. They settled in as best they could, not knowing how long they'd need to wait. Inches below them, the torrent continued to rise. The time is now 6 p.m. and the two men are still 200 feet below the surface. Worse, they know that if they make any sudden moves, they'll be swept below the freezing water, dragged along a rocky tunnel, and dashed against the ground at the base of the waterfall. Carefully, they huddled together under a blanket to keep from freezing to death. In order to conserve their batteries, they turned off their headlamps and sat in the cold, dark, and narrow cave. They would sit that way, fighting off hypothermia and insanity, for 14 hours. Jason spent almost all of that time steadying his breathing to prevent panic. In an attempt to keep his face warm, he pulled his sweatshirt above his nose. He thought about his family and wondered if his life insurance would cover the costs of his premature death. Meanwhile, Andrew silently chanted a passage from the science fiction novel Dune. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little black death that brings total oblivion. I will let the fear pass through me, and when the fear is gone, only I will remain. He wondered if his 6-month-old baby, Juniper, would have to grow up without a father. They both wondered if their other 3 buddies even made it out to the other side and called rescuers. Were they injured? Were they dead? Hours passed by and both men dozed in and out of sleep, jerking themselves awake each time, terrified of losing control and slipping. Every 20 minutes or so they reassured each other that they're both still hanging in there. Every so often, one of the men would switch on a headlamp, casting a pale light onto their dire predicament. Each time they saw that the water wasn't slowing. However, the next morning at 5 a.m., they checked again. Finally, the water appeared to be receding. At 6 a.m., the water had gone down just enough for the men to keep their heads above it to escape. The two unfolded their stiff bodies and began to make their way back. But with each step Jason took, a strained muscle in his groin caused him to scream out in excruciating pain. Nevertheless, he was determined to continue. As they were climbing through, sometimes in water up to their chins, again they made a couple of surreal discoveries. One of them was that their friends weren't lying injured or dead. They must have made it out. The second discovery was equipment bags left behind along the way. Rescuers had been here, but where were they now? Andrew commented on wanting to crawl into their sleeping bags and wait for them, but Jason wanted to keep moving. 90 minutes of hiking later, they were finally nearing the entrance of the Cascade. Jason noticed something flickering in the distance. Soon after that, they both heard voices. They called out, desperate for a response. One came. Just above the entrance, a search and rescue team was ready to get them out. Thankfully, their 3 other friends had escaped, and within just a few hours of Andrew and Jason becoming stuck, volunteer rescuers swarmed the steel door of the Cascade. At one point, there were 50 people from British Columbia and Alberta Cave Rescue, BC Ambulance, and the Alberni Valley Rescue Squad. Despite the flooding in the early morning hours, rescuers had made it within 25 feet of Andrew and Jason, but the water was too ferocious and it was impossible for them to continue. They retreated back to the entrance, deciding it was safer to wait out the water level. Andrew and Jason escaped just as they were attempting another rescue. After a grueling 16 hours trapped in the dark between jagged rocks and icy water, the 2 men were finally out, their eyes momentarily stunned by the bright light. Never in all their years had the sun felt so warm. Sometime after, the 2 men say that they're incredibly lucky to have survived such a harrowing experience. With Andrew being a former cave diving instructor, this was his most terrifying encounter with death, but he still understood that they had a good chance of escaping. Jason, though, had only been caving a handful of times, and it wouldn't have been surprising if he dropped the hobby altogether. However, they both returned to Cascade Cave shortly after this incident. They needed to retrieve some of the caving equipment they'd left behind, but also they said they needed to fight their demons and face their fear of the cave head-on. Jason's love for his new hobby was far more important than letting the trauma overcome him. He was quoted as saying, "The lure of the adventure and exploration and discovery is just too strong."